To my video on independent and dependent variables. So you've probably heard of these terms in science before, and they mean the same thing that they did in science. So the independent variable is the input value, so the number we're plugging in, which is typically the x value. Okay, the dependent variable is the output value, which is typically the y value. So the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. Okay, so we have identifying the independent dependent variable. So this is, recall that y equals mx plus b is the slope-intercept form. And so the x value here is the independent variable. So this is our input, so the number we're plugging in. And when we plug that in, we multiply the slope times the independent variable plus the y-intercept, and that gives us the output value, or the dependent variable. Okay, so let's look at some examples. It says, what are the independent and dependent variables in the linear function below? Okay, so let's look here. We have our x value. We have our y value. So here, this is in slope-intercept form, so we're taking the slope times the input, so our independent variable is our x, and then we multiply by the slope and subtract 5, and that gives us our output, or the dependent variable. Okay, now they won't always use x and y, so look here at number 2. Fran drove m miles in a car she rented. To find r, the total cost of renting the car, she used the formula. Well, here's the key word here. To find r, the total cost. Okay, so if we look at this in y equals mx plus b here, we notice that the x in this case is the m, and which is the independent variable, and the y, or the r in this case, is the dependent variable. So that means when we want to know what is the dependent variable in the formula, we are looking for r. And when you're looking for the independent dependent variable, it's going to be a letter, not a number. Okay? Or a variable. Okay? Remember, a variable is a letter. Okay, so let's move on to number 3. It says the formula for the circumference of a circle is c equals pi times d, where c is the circumference and d is the diameter. Identify the dependent variable. So once again, we're looking at this, and if we look at it as y equals mx plus b here, okay, this is what the equation equals, and here is we're multiplying the letter by pi here. So it's really 3.14d. So the dependent variable is going to be the circumference. So c is the dependent variable. Okay, because you're multiplying the diameter by pi, and that's going to give you the circumference. So that's what the equation equals. Okay, number 4. The formula for the volume of a rectangular prism is V equals 1/3 length times width times height, where L is the length of the pyramid's base, W is the width of the pyramid's base, and H is the height of the pyramid. Which of the following is the dependent variable? So the volume is going to depend on what the length, width, and height are. So that makes the volume the dependent variable. And also the equation equals the volume. So we're going to circle C, volume of pyramid. And I didn't do that very well. So hopefully you do a better job than I do. Okay, turn to the back side. So now we're going to look at a table. So in a table, the input, or x value, is the independent variable. And then the output, or y value, is the dependent variable. So here's our example. Below is a table of values where c equals pi times d, where d equals the diameter and c equals the circumference. So typically in a table, the first set of values will be your x, and the second set of values will be your y. Okay, but here they use different letters, but that will help us figure out which one's the independent and dependent. So it says, what are the independent and dependent variables in the table? Well, since you are plugging in the diameter, and that changes the circumference, that means the circumference depends on what the diameter is. So that makes the diameter the independent variable, and the dependent variable is the circumference. Okay, you're plugging in a diameter, and the circumference is what the equation equals. So look back at this. Okay, now, independent and dependent variables, verbal descriptions or a practical problem. Okay, so the independent variable, there's a phrase here called I'm a doctor. Okay, so the independent variable is what you are manipulating. So I manipulate the input value. Okay, so that's what I'm plugging in. The dependent variable is R, which I'm looking for, respond, and changes the output value. So I manipulate the input value, and the dependent variable responds. Okay. So I is the independent. So independent manipulates I manipulate the dependent variable, then responds. Okay, so some clues for independent variable. It's being multiplied. Whoops. Being multiplied, that's IED. Sorry, that's not real clear there. So it's being multiplied by the slope or the rate of change. So an example might be like tickets per student or cost per bag of popcorn, something like that. The dependent variable clues are the result, total cost, and then if you have formulas, it would be the volume or area, etc. Okay, let's look at some practical problems or examples here, verbal descriptions. Example number 1, John measured the length of each side of a square. He uses that value to calculate the perimeter. So think about which one you are manipulating here, and hopefully you figured out that you are manipulating the length, okay? And the dependent variable is going to be the perimeter because you're going to manipulate the length and the perimeter is going to respond, okay? So basically the perimeter depends on whatever the length is, okay? So number 2, David measures how many inches his tomato plant grows every week, okay? So think about here what we are manipulating here. So we're manipulating the weeks here, okay? And the inches are going to respond based on the weeks, okay? Now, number 3, this one's a little bit trickier. Jake works as a salesperson. He earns $1,275 per month plus an 8% commission on his total sales. So commission is basically what you earn in addition to your monthly salary or what you're making. So for example, car sales or real estate agent. So a car salesman, if they sell one car, they get 8% of that. Okay, in addition to their $1,275 per month. Or if they sell 2 cars, they would get 8% of that, or 3 cars, etc., etc. Okay, so the independent variable is going to be how many sales they have. Okay, and the dependent variable is going to be this salary. Okay, so the salary is going to depend on how many sales Jake has that month. Okay, that concludes our notes on independent and dependent variables. I hope you have a great day.